Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So, bi-weekly meeting for my multi-tenancy working group. Quick note from myself about some upcoming events, primarily KubeCon, and then Adrian will be covering the design overview and demo of the hierarchical namespaces controller work that he's been doing. We have also Shikha from IBM who are going to talk about some of the work they're doing, and if there's some time, I might provide some additional updates on some of the work happening in different threads of the working group. As far as KubeCon, so we are going to have, just like last time, working group sessions, both an introductory as well as a deep dive. Between Tasha and myself, we'll be essentially summarizing the work that all of you are doing and trying to lay out where we think the working group is going in future. We also have a panel discussion where some of you are also participating, and we'll hope to engage with a wider audience there, try to get more contributors, try to get more requirements, see what the industry is thinking. And in addition, on the Contributors Summit, the day before the main conference, Tasha has set up some sessions. So if you're all going to be, any of you are going to be in San Diego, you are most welcome and recommended to join the Contributors Summit, where you'll be able to talk to others working in this area or interested in this area. Plus, I think as we get closer to the conference, we can plan additional informal get-togethers during the conference so that we can meet each other both socially as well as exchange technical notes. That's all I have for KubeCon. Now we'll kick off Adrian, who's going to talk about hierarchical namespaces and the work that he's been kicking off. So go ahead, Adrian.
Okay, sounds good. Just one very quick question about that. Are all of the sessions either on the contributor summit on the Monday or the panel discussion, which I believe is on Tuesday, or are there other things as well?
So no, there's the working group sessions. So
when are those?
The working group track is basically, so basically just every working group gets these working group wraps. And so at the moment, Tasha and I are handling that. You know, you're all welcome to, not just welcome, you're most, it would be great if you can all join in. And we will be essentially providing a summary of the working group activities.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to give my somewhat delayed demonstration of the hierarchical namespace controller. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, the HNC, Hierarchical Namespace Controller, this is a project that I've been working on as a complement to some of the earlier work that's been going on around the tenancy controller. We use tenancy or tenant operator. I don't think we've settled on a name yet. And so Shikha and for others who are new, what this is really for like multi-team tenancy or soft multi-tenancy. I think it's the S1 scenario, if my memory is correct, where you basically have a bunch of people from typically the same company that are sharing a cluster. So think a lot of different development teams that are working to share a large cluster, either for development purposes or to actually run their production services. This is not for either to make Kubernetes itself multi-tenant. So for example, this is not something that Google would use. Sorry, I work for Google. This is not something that Google would use to expose a Kubernetes cluster to do different customers. This is not something that you would necessarily use as part of your SaaS solution. If you are running, let's say, a WordPress deployment for each of your customers, you could if you wanted to, but that's not really what it's designed for. So it's really the multi-team scenario. So I was going to give this demo about 4 weeks ago now exactly, and I wasn't able to make it because my computer went down, and so let's see if we can get past that for today. Since then, I have also been able to post all of this code to GitHub, so this is all now part of the repository. So I'm just going to give an example of how one might use the hierarchical namespace controller to set up a hierarchy of namespaces and how you can use this to organize access to a cluster among your team. So let's say that you've got an organization called Acme Org. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a namespace that represents that entire organization. And you might have within that a team, let's call it just team A, and that team might run a service, which we're just going to call service one. Now you might say, well, why not? Why do we need to have a namespace for the service itself? Why not just have all of the services owned by the team within that namespace? And the answer is that for isolation purposes, because really only namespaces are a boundary where you can control access, it is often a good idea to keep keep services isolated into a single namespace under some circumstances, not always necessary. Now, let's say that you have some org-wide SREs, reliability engineers, or sorry, some team-wide SREs. And so here I'm going to create some RBAC roles and role bindings. So you've got the role called Team A SRE, and they can update deployments. And then you'll create a role binding that, in this case, I'm just going to give it to the service account in Team A because I'm not running on a real cluster right now. I'm running on Kind, Kubernetes, and Docker. And so there's no real users on that other than the service accounts. And so you can have those kind of SREs for the team. You can also have them for the organization. So here you've got a role called organization SRE, and once again, the service account in the Acme org has that privilege. Now, of course, nothing that I've done here will affect service one. There is no relationship at all between the different namespaces, and even though organizationally I've said that there's a relationship. So this is where we start using the HNC. And so one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to call this new command called kubectl HNC set parent. I'm going to say that the parent of team A is Acme org. And what that's going to do is it's going to copy down the resources from Acme org to team A. And then I'm going to do the same thing for team A to service one. I typed it in wrong. So here I tried to set the parent of Acme org back to team A, which created a cycle, so that was rejected. So just if we correct that. So now I'm going to say the parent of service one is team A, and that works much better now. And we can quickly see the directory structure that we set up here, which is that Acme org is the parent of team A and team A is the parent of service one. Now, before we looked inside the service one namespace, there were no role bindings or anything. But if we look now, we can see that actually there are two, one for the org SREs and one for team A SREs. And if we have a closer look at, let's say, the roles, we can see that they're exactly what we expect, which is the update permission on deployments. And you can also see that they've been labeled, showing where these policies came from. So we can see that org SRE came from the namespace Acme org, whereas team A SRE came from the namespace team A, as you would expect. So the controller will keep all of these things in sync with the current hierarchy. So let's say that you have another namespace or another team called team B. And so I've just added a namespace for them. And so you can see now that team B is also a child of Acme org, and we're going to create some roles and role bindings there as well. Just to make it easier to show up, I'm going to call these wizards instead of SREs. And now I can change the parent of service one from team A to team B. And if we have another look at the tree, we can see that the tree has been updated to reflect that. And we can have another look at the roles, and we can see that the team A SRE has disappeared and has been replaced by a team B wizard. And so what this shows is that the agency is constantly reconciling the different policy objects with the current state of the hierarchy. Now, this doesn't just work for RBAC roles. So for example, let's say that team B has some credentials that they share among all of their services. So we can create, this is just so you can see it. So I've just created some secret called my credentials with a very simple password. And this is inside Team B, but as you might imagine, if we look inside Service 1, which is a child, we will see that my credentials has shown up there. But of course, if we move that service back to Team A, have another look at the secrets, you'll see that my creds has been deleted because it no longer exists there, and the tree has been restored to what we started with. Now, of course, not all customers will want to share secrets in that way. Some people will not want them to automatically propagate down. And so that is all going to be configurable at some point. You'll be able to add your own types. So for example, if you've got a CRD that you want to be copied because it represents a policy, that is something that you can do as well. So that's the basic outlines of the hierarchical namespace controller as it exists. So not all of these changes have been checked in yet. The webhook that you saw and the kubectl plugin have not actually gone into the main repo yet, but other than that, this is pretty much what's checked into GitHub. Everything else is currently either being pull requested or is on my fork and just waiting for earlier changes to go through. So that's it, and I'm happy to answer any questions if people have any.
So Adrian, this is excellent, awesome. Can you talk about which objects are allowed to be inherited from parent to child?
So right now it's hard-coded. Right now it's roles, role bindings, and secrets. That's it. But as I said, it is all going to be configurable. The code's all written to be generic. So there's basically just 3 lines in the setup code where we add those 3 kinds, and at some point we'll take out the hard coding and replace it with something that's configurable. I suspect that at a bare minimum, we will leave in roles and role bindings as being hard-coded so that you cannot disable them, because one of the most important things that we expect this system to do is to be managing access to the objects themselves, and the admission webhooks are going to actually enforce some checks. And so it may not make sense to have the HNC without RBAC. But once again, I could be wrong. We'll see what user demand is.
So
sorry, go ahead.
How do the inherited objects work? I mean, can somebody override those in the child namespace, or?
That's an excellent question. So I actually have 2 people who are joining us on this call for the first time. Ichi and Letitia are both in Waterloo, and they've started working with me on this project. And Ichi has a pull request that is currently undergoing review that will initially mark any objects that have been improperly modified, that were propagated and then changed, and then we're also going to update the webhook to prevent it. So the answer is, by default, no, you cannot modify a propagated object, because then an administrator of a child namespace could deny access to the administrator of a parent namespace, which is not something that's allowed, at least not generally. We will almost certainly at some point need to add exceptions, but the rule will basically be that only the person who has set up a policy can make exceptions to it. So if you are modifying propagated object, you must also have permission to modify the original object that it was propagated from. And that is going to be how we manage exceptions.
By the way, Sanjeev, I think for the other resources, at least in my mind, for example, CRDs today is a global sort of a scope versus network policy is actually namespace scope. I think from a use case perspective, I would like those as well to be sort of structured in a consistent way, because today there's not a good explanation of why actually things are defined that way. So it's a little bit aspirational, but just from a use case perspective.
Yeah, for network policy for sure. But when you say CRDs, are you really implying CRs, or the CRDs themselves are always globally scoped, right, in Kubernetes?
Yeah, true. So that's not, it's completely sort of a, aspirational. But for example, if people wanted to have their own scope, custom resources, then yes, I think there is a sort of a, I won't say there's a clear demand, but I think there is a kind of a, expectation there as well.
Yeah, just to be clear, I think it would be super valuable to have CRDs themselves be namespace scoped, but yeah, that's a core Kubernetes thing.
That's some ways off.
I know.
I'm not pretending. Yeah, The HNC cannot perform that kind of magic. I wish it could.
Right,
Yeah.
but at least the CRs themselves could follow the.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Once
true.
it's configurable. Yeah. Once we add configuration, you will be able to add CRs.
I think that should be good. Yeah, that should be good. Yes.
And I have given some thought to how this will integrate with things like network policy. Network policy, of course, is not aware of hierarchy because nobody is, but it can select based on the labels attached to namespaces. And so one of the things the agency will do is that for every ancestor of a namespace, it will apply a label indicating that ancestor. And so that will allow you to use labels to select a subtree. Obviously, the storage required for that will increase based on the depth of your tree. I'm thinking that any depth greater than even 5 is going to be rare. 10 is probably going to be. We might just limit it at some point because you're not going to want to have 1,000 namespaces deep. The system won't be designed for that.
Hey, Adrian, would it be fair to ask, since I'm joining for the first time and
Sure.
some of my team members are here as well. So how does this tie up with the overall multi-tenancy goal? Is this the architecture kind of aligning with the multi-tenancy to have, multiple tenants on single cluster and all the underlying artifacts align with this or work towards so that we have a layer on top of Kubernetes that makes sure that the tenancy is there?
So I think it depends. So it is a building block, which you could use either in a multi-tenant scenario or in a non-multi-tenant scenario if you just want to create whatever structures you like for your own management purposes. I think that what we are working towards, Faye, who is on the call, actually wrote a document about how we would integrate it with some of the other projects that are going on. So have you looked at the document for the tenant CRD or the tenant operator?
We briefly looked at it together. So yes,
Yeah.
we had some questions, but we didn't go through in detail, yes.
Yeah, so the tenant operator also defines a group of namespaces that are managed together as a unit. What I would say is that is a higher level concept. So for example, in the tenant CRD, you have a concept of admins and you have a concept of child namespaces, and those don't really exist as much in the HNC. There's no admin per se of an HNC. There are simply users who have certain permissions. And so what you can say is that HNC is kind of at the Kubernetes primitive level, whereas the tenant operator is at, and I suppose you could call it the application level. Mm-hmm. And so obviously we are looking at building, or you could say replatforming the tenant operator to be on top of the HNC so that it makes use of the same things. And so for example, you start out with the tenant operator and then you need some features that it doesn't expose, such as subtenancy. Then you can fall back on the HNC and use the more powerful. Does that answer your question?
Basically, at a high level, I think what you're saying is rely on the multi-tenancy operator to create the different tenants. And within the tenant, when you need the hierarchy of the namespaces for multiple subtenancy or sub-teams under the tenant, then HNC comes into play.
Yeah, I could generalize that maybe a little bit more. What I would say is that the tenant operator will be very opinionated, and it will say, this is one way we recommend you do tenancy. Yeah. If that works for you, that's great. And if you need any extensions, then this is a set of primitives that are kind of more decoupled, more building blocky, mm-hmm. that you can use instead of that, or independently of it, or any other kind of building block repaired on top.
And how mature is the tenant operator? When we looked at it, there were lots of open questions around it as well. I was trying to figure out where that is.
Sanjeev and Faye are the better ones to answer that question. I think it's currently being rebuilt on top of KubeBuilder v2, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so Shikha, so I would say that Faye has been making a lot of progress, but we still want to give it about another month or so before we sort of have a first usable version, mm-hmm. but definitely before KubeCon.
Okay, that's the goal. Okay.
Yeah, and likewise for HNC, I have heard reliable reports that exactly one other person other than me have ever installed it and gone through this demo. Probably two now that Ichi is working on this as well. So this is very early code for the HNC, and so it has not been used and would not. Yes, it's Sudeep. That's right. Mentioning on the chat that he was able to make it work. And as I said, that kubectl plugin which I showed today, that's hot off the press. I haven't even pull requested yet. So we're a ways away from making this work. However, there are 3 of us on Google who are now working on it, myself and 2 others, and so we are looking at productionization such as metric, webhooks for guardrails, integrations with network policy and stuff like that. So we want to get it very quickly to a stage where people can at least start playing with it in, maybe not in production, but at least in a something that's a little bit more than a toy.
Can I ask you quickly one question that maybe you mentioned I might have missed around deletion of namespaces that have hierarchies?
Great question. Yes, I didn't mention it. Go ahead.
Didn't mention it. So what are the rules around that? So when you had a topology of a bunch of namespaces and you try to delete a parent, what happens? You just bark, or is it going to start deleting the tree?
So the funny thing is that I've heard people say that they would like different things. And so one kind of weaselly answer I could give is that we might make it configurable. So one answer is that if you want cascading deletion, we'll set up the owner's references from the children to the parents. And so if you delete the parent, the whole subtree gets wiped out. Another is that we set up webhooks to stop you from deleting parents if the child has not yet been deleted. But I haven't done that yet either. And then the third answer is that what happens today, if you download it and try it out, is that there will be a condition that is placed on the child. So the parent will be deleted. All of the objects that were, actually, no, that's not true. The parent will be deleted, and you will see a condition appear on the child namespace that says, hey, I'm pointing at a missing parent. Right now, I think today, all of the objects from that parent will be deleted. That is probably, we're probably going to change that so that they'll just stick around until you either actively unset the parent and then the objects will be deleted, or you recreate the parent. One of the reasons it is important to allow a namespace to exist pointing to a parent that does not exist is if you want to kubectl apply a directory and just create a whole bunch of namespaces and their hierarchical links. If we insisted that you could not have a child pointing to a parent that didn't exist, you would very carefully have to traverse all of those in order. And so
I would expect it also has something to do with the ownership of the propagated objects, right? Because if you delete the parent and the objects were created at the parent level, isn't the ownership at the parent associated with the parent?
Yes, it is associated. Even though the parent is now gone, those objects still belong to the deleted parent, which means that if we ever say, okay, this is correct, I no longer want this namespace to be pointing to that absent parent, all of those objects will immediately be deleted.
By the way, do we track these questions or feature requests in the current repository under HNC? I think it's really important to sort of track and make sure that we kind of make a conscious decision on a behavior, because it's pretty powerful, but at the same time, I can imagine people getting a little bit confused with behavior. So
sure,
tracking and reflecting that probably is a good thing to do in general.
So what I would say is that yes, we should. I've filed a few issues. No, I haven't. I filed one issue so far. The rest of these issues are discussed in the design document, which is linked to from the repository. So the question of what do you do when a parent is deleted, out of order creation, this is all covered right now in the design document. So please do go have a look at it if you have, I'm happy to answer questions, but if you want to learn more, if you want to comment, it's all there. And some of these things will, of course, evolve as we, as people hopefully start to use it and start having opinions about how it should work.
And your design document is part of the chat?
It is linked to from the repo. I can see that they have. I'm guessing that is Faye's.
I think it should be. If you have a link to the notes to this meeting, I think Adrian has already.
Okay, I'll go look. Yeah.
We'll put it in the. We'll put it in the meeting minutes. We'll have it in the meeting minutes so you can look.
Thank you so much.
Adrian, is that all you have? Any more questions for Adrian before we switch to the next section? So thank you, Adrian. Yeah, this is really cool stuff. And I'll just add one more point here that as you can imagine, this HNC work is both a building block for multi-tenancy as well as a cool feature by itself. So whatever the long-term plan for this is still a little bit open. You know, it could very well end up being its own project, and you know, we would be happy to support it and champion it wherever its home ends up being. So for now, you know, it is sort of very related to multi-tenancy, but as you can imagine, this has value by itself. So we'll be open to various different possibilities of its long-term home. So it's currently been incubated as part of multi-tenancy, but we'll have to see over time what the community feels like in terms of where it should end up.
By the way, Sanjeev, we really appreciate it. I think more than happy to kind of contribute to the multi-tenancy sort of more capabilities. So initial target is that, but I agree that, you know, it could be, we could see a kind of different path in the future, but I really appreciate the kind of hosting here. Yeah.
Right. And actually that tells me that let me, before Shikha starts her section, I can provide that update, which I was planning to provide at the end, because that might lead into some of the questions that new attendees like Shikha might have, or anybody else that hasn't been following the group. So let me take just 2 minutes and share an update. And hopefully that might help people who haven't been familiar with the multi-tenancy working group.
Yeah, sounds good.
Are you going to present?
I'm going to present in just a minute here.
Sure.
I've just put the HNC design doc into the chat for anyone who wants to have a look.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to share is the kind of update that we provide to other teams when we talk about what the Kate's multi-tenancy working group is doing. Okay. And most recently we've done this. We talked to the policy working group, and just today morning, we had a presentation to the financial users working group. And both of these working groups are very actively, very interested in multi-tenancy. So I'm just going to share this because this is what we tell others of what multi-tenancy working group is doing. And it's useful for new members in this group as well to kind of get a quick summary. So these are the threads that are currently happening in the multi-tenancy working group. Okay. Let me adjust the size here. 1 second.
I can see okay though.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a summary of all that's happening in the working group, right? So first thing we've been doing is defining an overall multi-tenancy architecture framework, right? So we categorized the different approaches. We defined, for convenience, certain models, A, B, C, and D. And the current focus is largely on compute, networking, and security aspects of multi-tenancy. But eventually, storage, monitoring, and all the other aspects, we would want to have a reference model for that as well. Okay. Then we started on some documentation of multi-tenancy reference configurations or reference profiles, which are essentially initial cluster config to set it up for multi-tenancy for these models that we talk about in the framework, right? And that is still a little bit early, and we want to get input from within the working group as well as outside as to how opinionated we want to make these reference configurations. Then another track of work is developing these models B and C in terms of the tenancy control plane, right? And specifically, what we're calling model D is also sometimes called as namespace grouping model, right? Which is essentially a tenant controller or tenant operator managing a set of namespaces and resources belonging to a tenant. So we had a V1 of that, which we did a POC and demoed in KubeCon. And now under development is V2, which is KubeBuilder based, which is being led by Faye. Okay. Now, although I have listed hierarchical namespaces here, as we said earlier, this is actually independent of these multi-tenancy models. We could use hierarchical namespaces as part of these models, but it is also a standalone feature by itself. So I'm just putting it here with the note that it has value by itself as well, but it can plug into these multi-tenancy models as well. Then model C is what has also been known as the virtual clusters model, right? That came largely from the folks at Alibaba Cloud. And there is also K3V, which we haven't yet discussed within this working group yet, from the Rancher folks, which is doing something similar. And again, Faye and team are working on developing that further within the incubator folders of the multi-tenancy working group. And then Faye has also documented unifying models B and C. For example, we just had the discussion about leveraging the tenant CRD from model B along with the virtual clusters from model C. And then other things that are happening is we continue to review and collect user requirements. We have been reviewing all these directions with other working groups, as I said, the policy working group, sig-auth, and so on. And so this is kind of a one-slide summary on sort of the different tracks and how they relate to each other within this working group.
He said, say Sanjeev, for new people, how can we figure out what are the different models that you're talking about?
Yeah, so we'll have another refresher at some point, but basically this is one way we had categorized it when we gave an update at KubeCon Barcelona. And I'll give you just a 2-minute summary for now.
Thank you.
Model A is multiple clusters managed by some kind of cluster management service, but running on an IaaS, right? So basically here, this is multiple independent tenant clusters,
right,
separated by VMs on an IaaS. Model B is a single Kubernetes cluster where X number of resources, including namespaces, are grouped under one tenant. Tenant is a new CRD along with associated CRDs, right? This is where we talk about the tenant operator.
Right.
And so that's what we call the namespace grouping model, also known as Model B. Model C is right here, which is the virtual clusters proposal, which is essentially Kubernetes on Kubernetes, which is tenant Kubernetes clusters running on a super Kubernetes. Again, this is what the Alibaba team is developing further, and the entire working group will be able to contribute to it soon. And this is similar to Model A, except instead of running tenant clusters on an IaaS, you're running a full cloud native stack, tenant clusters on a underlay Kubernetes. And Model D is our theoretical possibility that if core Kubernetes were to be rewritten to include tenancy as a first class object, then that would be Model D.
Okay.
So this is sort of, and then there are various sort of hybrids, and like HNC can fit into multiple of these as a building block and so on. So when we talk about these models, this is how we kind of created 4 categories so that whenever people have different notions of multi-tenancy, we can talk in the context of a particular model. And then our working group has been largely devoted to models B and C in the recent months. So we are largely focusing on models B and C, as well as building blocks like HNC, cluster profiles, security profiles, and so on. So
B and C, and C is pretty much you have a cluster to handle or manage the multiple tenant clusters. That's just the difference between cluster managing the tenants versus they're all on the infrastructure IaaS layer. Okay.
Right. We were not planning to spend too much time on this. Faye will definitely have an update for us in one of the future meetings.
Yeah.
So
okay.
This was kind of the quick summary so that everybody gets caught up on how are we summarizing this working group's current tasks? Because this is what we tell other working groups when we talk about what the multi-tenancy working group is doing.
Quick question about option D, right? Which clearly would have been the best solution. I realize it's a long-term impact. Is there any real hope that it will ever happen, or we should just say this is just like you mentioned? You called it theoretical, as if oh yeah, wishful thinking.
It is wishful thinking because folks from the API server team have indicated that this is what they would have liked as the ideal model, but at this point it requires a new team of 10 to 15 new developers to go back and re-architect Kubernetes, which is
so there's some work they have to do to deal with scope CRDs if that's ever going to happen. So maybe that would be the right place to try to tackle some of this.
Yeah, this is just my personal opinion. I think that if we were to demonstrate, like, as you move from A to B to C, you demonstrate, and then as all of those things get users, you will demonstrate a demand for D. I think that that's how it works. So the more people we have using models B and C, the more they'll start to chafe against the restrictions that they have and say, hey, why can't I have multiple versions of the same CRD in different namespaces? Why can't I, why do I need to have a separate API server running for different customers? Why isn't the API server hardened enough to separate the tenants? And then I think that incrementally you might move towards something that starts to look more and more like D until we can make that official sort of last push.
right. Yeah, so we'll have to wait and see. Also, on that one point about the CRDs, right? With Model C, you can have different CRDs for different tenants because everybody gets their own API server. So in fact, Model C does give you the flexibility of CRDs per tenant.
Right, but for some use cases, like some of the use cases that we're interested in, I work for a telco, is container network functions. In those cases, extra layers of virtualization are going to make too complex what we're trying to do with a network. So no, we wouldn't be interested in that, right? So for us, we got to make B work for, even if it means things like the CRD is a cluster level admin and you tell me what you want, I'll create it for you, and then you can manage the CRs type of system.
Yeah, I think the advantage to D over something like C, I think that D is kind of taking the best parts of B and C. So with B, you are allowed to open up things from one tenant to another if you wish, including network connections, RBAC, anything. With C, that's impossible. And then with D, I think you could probably add that back in. So you kind of want the ability to have the guarantees of C with the flexibility from B, and that's what gives you D. Is that Faye and Sanjeev, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, each of these are sort of building on top of building an additional level of flexibility. And so, yeah, D essentially combines the flexibility and benefits of, A, B, and C.
Yeah, I just want to add one more point. So at this moment, so everything we are talking about is, I would say, even we got to D, is not exactly the true multi-tenancy people are talking about, because we shouldn't forget one big component, which is node. The node level, you need to support a strong, network isolation. There are so many things that are broken in the node side. As far as I can see, is I suggest, we figure out the API server side of configuration, and our group should, in the future and not near future, think more about how to apply true hard multi-tenancy in the node side.
So with that, I know we were not planning to spend too much time on this. That was a brief update so that new folks can get kind of caught up on what are the different threads of activity in this working group and how are we messaging that outside of this working group. If we need to have more on this refreshers, we will have that as future items. We can switch now. Shikha, if you want to share your team's thoughts or requests, we have about 15 minutes left, and you're welcome to use that to share your thoughts and your presentation.
Sure, we can do that. Although my screen is frozen right now. Is it frozen for other people as well? Oh, because you're sharing.
You can go ahead and start sharing. It'll take over from me.
Yeah, I can see other people moving just fine, but the screen is shared.
You can also start screen share while the other person is sharing, is what I get.
Oh.
So I was trying to go through, well, okay, maybe let me share now. So this, coming fresh to this forum, what we did was to bring in our use cases. That's what we decided to move forward, and then figure out how we align with how things are proceeding in the work group, and where we can actually come together or contribute. Some of the stuff that we will talk through will be maybe old discussions with you all, for you all, because you might have gone through these discussions previously, but it might be just good to sync up as to where we are, what our thoughts are, rather, not where we are, but what our thoughts are, and how we are looking at multi-tenancy. And just a background, we deal with customers that are kind of two kinds of customers. One are small telco customers who have to set up multi-tenancy, and they would rather use a single cluster to set up the multi-tenancy and save on resources, versus there are other customers who are wanting to set up multi-tenancy for the scale of a cloud provider, where they have multiple clients, and each client is a big enough client to be owning a few thousands of clusters. So those are the two extreme use cases that we struggle with. I was not aware of this work group until recently. As we found out, we decided to bring our use cases, and I'll be happy to put it wherever you suggest, Sanjeev, to put these. We have certain use cases that we wanted to go through, what we are trying to do, and align as we move forward. So some of this will be like, oh yeah, that's what we are working on. So, but let me just go through it. So what we want to get to is multiple tenant sharing a single instance of a cluster, which I think was your model B, or we have a use case, we have a multi-cluster management, if you have heard of that, and multi-cluster management running, multi-cluster manager running on a hub or running on a single cluster, and managing multiple clusters assigned to different tenants. So which in my mind was your model C. So that's where it's a combination of B and C that we are dealing with.
Wait, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Who is running the multi-account or multi-tenant cluster? Is it IBM, or is it one of IBM's customers who's then further subdividing it?
So we have both the use cases. We have something called IBM Cloud, which is IKS, where we will be running the cloud or clusters, and there we have use cases where our clients will be running, will be the cloud providers. So we have both the use cases.
Okay, thanks.
So it's like eat your own dog food in that case. So we need to be really, really secure in these scenarios. And the second one is system is secure in such that no account can access each other's configurations, data, logs, call it. So this is the one I think somebody just talked about. What if multi-tenancy was part of the K8 itself, and there's so much more stuff on top of it to get the tenancy worked out. So that's the second piece of it. We have some use cases. This is not very big in my mind, where you can switch between two different accounts. Role-based access control, some of it was what Adrian was showing. We do want to have the role-based access control. Now there's a slight difference where we use identity and access manager to create these teams, create the users, assign resources to those users, and those resources could be Kubernetes resources, or could be non-namespace, non-Kubernetes resources as well. And we have some admission controllers to make sure that users have the right permission to before they create the resources within their teams. They have access to creating those resources. Then the next one is the account rules and enforcement of account rules. So once we create, like we're talking in this call, once we have these tenants or different accounts, we want to have some account rules in place. Now, these rules can be more like policies. Somebody mentioned the policy work group as well. These are more like policies. And then we want to have the layer to enforce these rules. So a simple example that we are tackling right now and trying to get it in one of our products is be able to enforce number of clusters a tenant can create, or number of namespaces rather a tenant can create. So along that line. So those are the use cases that we have, and I'm sure Sanjeev and team, these are similar to what you all have been talking about, looking at the update. So that's where
pretty much.
Yeah, that's where we think that the work that we are trying to tackle is very much aligned. I'm just trying to figure out where does the alignment come from, like where you talked about the multi-tenancy operator or tenant operator. I can connect with you later, Sanjeev, where the maturity of that one, or how and when will that be available, or what's left in it so we can contribute as well. And then HNC does make sense a lot hooking under the tenant operator itself. So couple of things that we also have established, like account, same as tenant we talk about. And then of course, we would want account to be able to bring their own LDAP or be able to have their own OIDC provider. Account admin for us is different from cluster administrator. Cluster administrator has access to the whole cluster, and account admin will have access to only certain, for lack of better, maybe some certain namespaces. And once he has, if we are talking of a single cluster, and then be able to create his own team, create his own namespaces, create policies. These are the same policies that I talked about earlier, policies to manage the tenant or manage the account itself.
And sorry, just remind me, I wasn't entirely clear on what a team means in this context. We've got accounts, inside accounts you have teams, inside teams you have namespaces, is that right? Or are they orthogonal in some way?
They're somewhat orthogonal. So account is a work area inside the cluster that account can work in. So you create an account, and there is an account admin that is pretty much like a cluster administrator within that account, and that account actually has a collection of namespaces assigned to that account as a resource. And a
team is kind of like a role binding. Is that?
Team is like a role binding. So team for us is actually the users in the LDAP.
Okay.
Or groups that can be assigned to that account and only to that account. So this can be considered as client A administrator. So there are multiple clients in the multi-tenancy. Client A, client B. Client A admin is the account admin. Client A users are all the team, and whatever namespaces you kind of isolate and assign as resources to the account becomes those resources that the account can see.
Okay, so like in my demo, I talked about like the org SRE, so that would be a team in this case.
Yes, that would be an org. Sorry, that you put the team under the I think your Acme namespace.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, and your hierarchical namespace was very interesting because we within account we would want some namespaces to be assigned to some users and others to the other ones as well. The service provider is more like IBM setting up the cloud provider or some other client setting up the cloud provider, and being able to access all the accounts. But we don't want the even IBM to look at, or the cloud provider to look at all the details for the account as well. So there has to be some masking there as well. So that leads to this picture. There's more details in here if anybody wants to look at it. But this looks like very similar to, I think, your model B or C, I forget now. But the idea is there is a cluster, Kubernetes cluster, where the accounts are onboarded. So these are, consider these as different accounts. And this is the cloud provider. So they onboard, once the account admin is onboarded, he onboards his members, and then there are namespaces that the account has access to, and this account has access to a number of clusters that they can now work in. And for us, clusters maps to namespaces. So that's kind of a high-level picture I wanted to bring on the table from our perspective or IBM perspective, and have some conversation as to how the SIG was going, or the work group, rather, not the SIG, but the work group is going, and how we can further collaborate or align.
So thanks, Shikha.
You're hoping to have basically potentially hostile users sharing a cluster, right? So the API server needs to be hardened against attacks from one account to another?
API server definitely needs to get hardened. That's true. I think that's the weak link that we have in the whole model, where there's a single API server.
Yeah, that was the difference between models C and D. Basically, model C gets around that by basically deploying one API server per account in your case.
Yes.
And then they share nodes between them, or at least in Fay, like in the Alibaba version, they share nodes, but they don't share API servers. So an exploit in one can't affect the others. So I think what you're showing here is model D.
So Sanjeev, would it be fine if you share your deck?
Yeah, we can do that. We're going to be running out of time pretty soon here. So I think here's what we could do. If you could copy your link here, and I'll also put this on the meeting minutes so that we can all look at your requirements. I agree that a lot of this model matches to one or more of the models that we shared earlier.
Right.
So let's all look at it, and then we can have more discussion on going forward. So yeah, I mean, right now we just have 3 minutes left, so I don't want to start off a new thread of discussion.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I'll figure out to put this out in the GitHub repo and share with you all. It's right now inside IBM GitHub repo, so I'll put it out in a GitHub repo and share it. If you can share your deck, that would be great for me to remember which model was which one.
Right. We'll have this in the minutes, and we have prior versions of this deck in KubeCon Barcelona as well. But we'll have some in the meeting minutes.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for letting me take you all through the overview of where we are heading, and of course, isolation of API server, and those things are really very much needed for this kind of a solution.
So thanks, Shikha. I think this is exciting because I think a lot of both vendors as well as end users are realizing that having dedicated clusters is not efficient, and a lot more people are now talking about shared clusters with some level of tenant isolation. So I think we're going to see more and more, and I think this working group can play a very important role in facilitating whatever the needs are. At the same time, we want to avoid getting spread too thin, because there's a lot of tracks here that we could be pursuing. So let's all collectively try to keep focused, and thanks to everyone, and special thanks to people like Adrian and Faye, who are really driving kind of core parts of these proposals. And look forward to having more engagement with you all on Slack as well as in future meetings. And please review documents from Adrian and Faye. We'll have the links for those as well. So with that, we'll end today's call. Let's stay in touch online as well as in future meetings. Talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye.